We're in our series on Exodus, and we have reached the big one. Well, one of the big ones. We have reached the crossing of the Red Sea today. That is a huge moment in the history of the Israelites, the history of faith. It is a huge moment in the history of the world. We are kind of close to the end of this series, just a few more weeks. And what's going to happen is we'll look at the Red Sea today. We'll look at kind of the aftermath of that, and then we'll look at the 10 Commandments, which are received by Moses, by the Israelites on Mount Sinai. And that will wrap up our series. We'll then move on to talk about Easter, some of that stuff. But today, the big one, the Red Sea, we're going to start out, as usual, with an illustration that is quite historical and thinking through details so we can get our imaginations into this. Not because it didn't happen, because it did happen. And we want to imagine what it was like to actually be there at the Red Sea. Because that's what's going to stir us up to then feel a lot like the Israelites did, or at least a little bit like the Israelites did. So we'll start out with that illustration. It's going to be quite detailed, and then we'll get, by the end, we'll read through the text, Exodus 14, that's the chapter where all of this happens. And then by the end of the message today, we will get to some very practical applications. I've said a number of times, this is a road to freedom, not just for the Israelites, but for us to follow today. So at the end of the message, we'll be looking at what does this crossing of the Red Sea have to do with me in 2025? And how can I follow the same pattern as the Israelites did, the right way, in my life today? Okay, so we'll begin looking at this question and imagining what this crossing of the Red Sea was like. There are basically two theories about this. Okay, so for most of recorded history, since the Exodus, it happened how long ago? 3,200 years ago, a little bit more than that is when this happened. The Israelites left Egypt. And for most of that time, nobody really, I'm sure in the beginning, the first several hundred years, everybody knew where the Exodus occurred. They knew where the crossing of the Red Sea was because they just remembered where it was. And after that, there was a lot to deal with for the Israelites. There was being exiled to different countries. And, most people, even after Jesus' time and people became Christians, most people didn't live in Egypt. And they didn't really know much about the geography of Egypt. And so people imagined the crossing of the Red Sea, but they didn't really think too much about where did it happen, or what did it really look like when those waters parted? Which waters parted, and how did they actually walk through this Red Sea? They didn't think too much about that because they had never been there and they didn't know anyone who'd been there. But about 300 years ago, so starting in the 1700s, this became a topic of great interest and something that has been studied very thoroughly. And we don't have a clear answer. There are two main theories. And these theories are put forward not just by, not mainly by unbelievers, right? These are mainly theories put forward by people who have researched it, many of whom are scientists or historians, but most of whom are Christians, or at least believe that the Exodus happened in some real way. People who are not believers often just say, well, this never happened. It's just a myth. It is not a myth. It is very clear in the text. They are recording something the way that it really happened. Not at all like the myths that are out there in other religions. It's really nothing like that. So the two theories are big Exodus or huge Exodus. Sometimes these are talked about as the Egyptian or the Hebrew theories. Sometimes they're talked about as small or large theories of the Exodus, but neither of them is small. And I want to emphasize that a lot as we go through it today. If you are someone or you encounter someone who's leans more toward the big Exodus theory, it is smaller than the huge Exodus theory, but it is not small by any means. It is a massive event either way. Okay, these two theories hinge on mainly the interpretation of the words that we translate as Red Sea in most Bibles. The word Red Sea that's in your Bible in Hebrew is Yam Suf. And Yam Suf 100% does not mean the Red Sea. It does mean a sea. Yam means sea. But Suf definitely does not mean red, and I won't go into all the details of why it's translated like that. Partly we've left it because nobody really knows how to translate it, or there is great debate. So does Yam Suf mean Red Sea? No, it does not. Okay, this was actually a Greek interpretation somewhere in like 300 BC, and maybe they were referring to a place that they knew to be the crossing of the Exodus or the crossing of the Red Sea, what we call the crossing of the Red Sea. Maybe they just weren't sure what it meant, even by that date, because that's already 1,000 years after the crossing of the Red Sea. The second theory is that it means Sea of Reeds. Who has heard this theory? That Yam Suf means the Sea of Reeds. All right, this is one theory on what it means, and this is often called the Egyptian interpretation because it relies on the assumption that this word Suf is actually not a Hebrew word. They are actually recording an Egyptian word that was a local place name, and if you take this word to be Egyptian, it means reeds, the Sea of Reeds. Now, if it is a Sea of Reeds, if that's the right way to understand this term, Sea of Reeds, what would that tell you? Yeah, it's not very deep. It can't be very deep. Also, it can't just be pure salt water. Reeds don't grow in pure salt water. They grow in either fresh water or brackish water, water that's mixed between salt and fresh water. So whether or not it means Sea of Reeds has huge implications for where the crossing of the Red Sea happened. Whoa, crazy. Here's the other interpretation. If you take Yam Suf to be literal Hebrew words, then it means the sea of the end. The sea of the end. What would that mean, the sea of the end? Probably, if it's literal Hebrew, I'll show you in a minute. There's some images we'll use of this, or maybe I've got one right on the screen. Okay, well, we'll go to it in a minute. The promised land for the Israelites later in the Old Testament, okay, later in the Pentateuch, in the first 5 books of the Bible, the land the Israelites are going to go into, it had borders. God told them where that land was going to be. On one side of it is going to be the Mediterranean Sea. On the other side of it is going to be the Jordan River. On the north is going to be the Sea of Galilee. And at the south of the Promised Land is going to be, guess what? Yam Suf, the Sea of the End. So if it's literal Hebrew, if that's the right way to interpret it, which is debated, end means the border of the Promised Land. And it also tells us a lot about exactly where this sea was. Okay, so let me show you the theories as well. This is a map of the big Exodus theory. All right, and here you've got, this is the Nile Delta, the Nile River Delta. You can see it's super green. This is Lower Egypt and where the Israelites would have lived when they were the Hebrews would have lived somewhere in this area right here. And the big Exodus theory is that they crossed, and remember it's still big, but it's not as huge as we'll get to the second theory in a minute. What did they cross? Not any of the huge waters down here. This theory is that they crossed probably a lake. There are some large lakes in that area, and those lakes have, guess what, on the borders of them? They have reeds. So this theory is that they crossed a very large lake. These lakes are not, hundreds of meters deep, but they are 3, 4, sometimes 5 meters deep. And that is certainly, if you think about what that means, think about a 4-meter wall of water. Could that destroy an army? It absolutely could. It absolutely could destroy Pharaoh's army. Okay? And then in this theory, they wander down through what is today we call the Sinai Peninsula. That's that whole kind of triangular area in the middle, and that's the desert where they wander around for 40 years. And here at the bottom is Mount Sinai, and then, they end up going up the other side and eventually into the Promised Land. This is the big Exodus theory. This is also the traditional theory. This location for Mount Sinai, this has been called Mount Sinai for at least 1,000 years. So in the medieval ages, this is what people thought it looked like. Except that, for a long time, Europeans especially did not know that this second body of water existed. European maps going back to even to the 1800s often did not include the second body of water, which is called the Gulf of Aqaba. They only included this, which is often called the Red Sea, or just the Suez Canal, that particular piece of it. Okay, so that's the big Exodus theory. Now, if it's true, if this is the correct way to understand it, then I'll show you the other theory. I guess we'll go back to big Exodus in a minute. Second theory is the huge Exodus theory. And if this theory is correct, and it has a lot going for it. I'll show you in a minute. This is where I lean. But both theories have evidence that point toward them from the Bible. This is why it's so hard. Both have Bible evidence. It's not like if you go for this theory, you really believe the Bible, and if you go for the other theory, you don't. Both have strong Bible evidence pointing toward them. This theory is that the Israelites crossed the Sinai Peninsula in about 10 days when they left Egypt, and that Pharaoh chased them across this entire peninsula, and then that they crossed what is today called the Gulf of Aqaba. And the biggest, probably there's lots of pieces that support this theory, but the biggest one is that in the rest of the Bible, this is Yam Suf. This is the bottom of the Promised Land. This is what the rest of the Bible calls the Red Sea. They cross here at the Gulf of Aqaba, and then they enter into what is today either Jordan or Saudi Arabia, the land of Midian, where Moses had been a shepherd for 40 years, and that Mount Sinai is somewhere over there, and we don't really know where. We haven't found it. There are some ideas about where it might be. Okay, that's the huge Exodus theory. So, if the big Exodus theory is true, if the big one is true, then here are some things that are true about the crossing of the Red Sea. If the first theory is correct. Then if the first theory, if it's a big Exodus, they crossed a sea of reeds pretty close to Egypt. In fact, when they fled from Pharaoh, they really only fled about 20, 25 kilometers before Pharaoh caught up to them. They crossed, it's a miracle where the winds part the water on this theory. And this is important because as we'll see when we read the text, it says that God brought a wind to part the waters. It says that flat out in verse 21. Now, does that mean only the wind parted the waters, or God was also miraculously parting the waters? I don't know. But if you start to think this through, what kind of wind does it take to move water apart? And how deep can wind actually move waters? How deep of water can it move? So it's a miracle where the wind parts the water, or where the wind can be the main or only force directed by God that parts the water. In this theory, the big Exodus, the distances are smaller and the numbers are lower. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but it's probably, or could be, a less people. Maybe we're understanding the numbers in the book of Exodus wrong. That's possible. Under this theory of big Exodus, it is a world-changing miracle. It is a massive world-changing miracle that changes the course of history. Now, this is a computer simulation that was done about 20 years ago, and this is a computer modeling to show a particular place in the Nile Delta, a lake called the Lake of Tanis, where a 65-mile-an-hour wind blowing for about 8 hours could, according to computer models, part the waters in a way that might fit the description in the book of Exodus. It's actually quite amazing. It actually parts the waters in such a way that when the Israelites would have walked through, it would have been off in the distance, but they would have seen water on either side of them, and the waters would have come back in from both sides. Pretty interesting. A lot of work has gone into this. Now, huge Exodus theory. If the huge Exodus theory is right, if Yam Suf is really the Gulf of Aqaba and they crossed there, then this miracle is not just a massive world-changing miracle. It's almost impossible to wrap your head around. Like you would maybe have spent the whole week thinking about this. This is the Gulf of Aqaba. Just look at it. What do you see? This is a modern picture, of course. What do you see in this picture? ocean container ships. What does that tell you about how deep the Gulf of Aqaba is? Indian Arm, which is near us here, and many of us have kayaked across or up and down Indian Arm. Indian Arm is about, in some places, it's very deep. Indian Arm is almost 300 meters deep in some places. The Gulf of Aqaba, at the shallowest place, is almost 500 meters deep. At its deepest points, it's 1,500 meters. And it's almost 10 times the width of Indian Arm. What? If this is where the Israelites crossed, you're talking about something that you almost can't wrap your mind around. You've seen lots of images like this of the crossing of the Red Sea, right? So this is the kind of thing we're trying to figure out. Did it look like this? You also have never, I guarantee you, you've never really tried to wrap your head around how many people Exodus is saying crossed the Red Sea. How many people would you say in this painting? That's an impressive crowd of people. How many people would you guess are represented in this painting? What do you think? Yeah, maybe a lot, right? 5,000. That's a massive amount of people. I don't even know how you would depict the number of people that Exodus says crossed the Red Sea. 600,000 men armed for war on foot, with all of their wives and children and all of their goats and sheep. 2 or 3 million human beings, maybe 2 million human beings with 3 million animals. People have spent a lot of time trying, like, if this really happened, like the Bible says, what would it have taken? And the answer is, you're talking about a crossing that's not like this. It would have to be at least 1 kilometer wide, at the very minimum. And crossing the Red Sea would have taken this group of people at the very fastest they could possibly go, maybe like 8 or 12 hours. Unless the crossing were even wider, maybe 2 kilometers wide, perhaps. If the Gulf of Aqaba is the crossing point, and it's 500 meters deep, then this is a massive understatement, this picture. Massive understatement. Those walls of water are not even close to high enough. Not even close. And there's also no way wind could part them. Even if you had hurricane force winds, you're not going 500 meters deep. There's no way. It would have to be supernatural, God sending a wind, and he's just moving the waters out of the way with supernatural force. No other choice. So if the huge crossing is correct, if that's the real picture, then here's some things that are true about it. Crossing the Gulf of Aqaba into Midian, the wind blows, but a powerful miracle is performed, primarily by supernatural power. It is a mind-blowing number of people, and huge distances. Under this theory, the Israelites, with 2 million people, they ran from Pharaoh, and in 10 days, they went 150 kilometers on foot. Is that possible? Yes, it's possible. If that's what it is, it's crazy. I don't know how else to... If this is really what happened, and this, I have to say I lean toward this theory because there's more Bible evidence toward this than there is toward the other. If this is really what happened, it's the craziest thing that's ever happened in human history. Period. Bar none. Hands down. There is no, even just if you talk about moving animals, the largest cattle drives that we know of in history, in the Middle Ages or in the Wild West, like 50,000 animals. Talking about 2 or 3 million sheep and goats. Whoa. Okay, I hope you find this fun. I could talk about this all day. We'll move on into the text. Crazy. And I love it not because it's super important to know the details. Look, we're going to end this sermon and not really know which of those it is. But it's important because we have to bring ourselves into the text as if we were there. And you've got to do some work in this area in order to do that. Otherwise, you're not going to feel what's happening to the Israelites because the story is astonishing, either theory that's true. Let's jump right into the text here. This is where we were at last week, looking at an image of the pillar of fire. They've left Egypt. They've got this massive number of people who are wandering across the desert. We saw last week how they kind of made a plan where they were going to go, and then God changed their plan. And God changed their plan in such a way that they would get stuck. They get stuck by God's design. And what God says is the reason I'm going to have them get stuck right in front of this ocean, this Red Sea, is because I'm going to show the Egyptians, not just the Israelites, but the Egyptians, that I am the Lord. And the Israelites have this pillar of fire and cloud going with them, a visible reminder that the Lord is with them all the time. And so here, we're going to read actually the whole chapter 14. We'll do it in two parts. And this part we read yesterday, so I won't spend too long on it, but we'll just remind you of a few things. This is the build-up to the actual crossing, parting of the Red Sea, and then the crossing of it. The Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea, directly opposite Baal-zephon." You can see right here, once again, I've said this so many times, this is not a myth. These are names of places that people in those days knew where these places were. The text is giving you details so that you can understand where it is. Problem is, today, no one has any idea what these places are. There's about 10 different theories on what each of these names is, what location it actually is. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around in the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. So God intentionally takes them to the sea, and he intentionally makes it look like the Israelites don't know what they're doing. Has God ever done that to you in your life? Has it ever seemed like God led you to a place in your life where there was no way out, and where everybody else around you is going, that person was a fool to do that. But you did it because you were trying to follow God? Yes, I'll raise my hand. Yes, I've been in that place many times. I felt like that. I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. The focus of the miracle of the Red Sea is God revealing himself to the Egyptians. That's clear in the text. The Israelites get a lot out of it too. But the main thing God gave the Israelites was all those plagues and then Passover to remember and believe. Now, of course, the Red Sea helps them. But the focus in the text of what God actually says is that he's trying to show the Egyptians that there's only one God. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds and said, "What have we done? We've let the Israelites go and have lost their services." They lost their slaves. Slaves were incredibly valuable in the ancient world. What they are saying effectively is, we just lost billions of dollars. Let's go get it back. So he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots, along with the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened or strengthened the heart of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. Again, all kinds of little details in this text that we can use to, some of these people in the theories anyway, use. We're not going to spend too much time on it today. But people use to try and figure out where exactly were they. They're marching out boldly. Pharaoh has to chase them down. Are they really only 20 kilometers from Pharaoh's hometown? I don't know. Seems like a lot further. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, his horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites. So there's a chase here. It takes them some time. And you'll see in a minute, the Israelites don't expect to see the Egyptians again. It seems like the Israelites are out of Egypt. They're gone. And when they see the Egyptians, they're going to be surprised. But the Egyptians overtake them as they are camped by the sea near Pi-hahiroth, opposite Baal-zephon. So God also keeps them there until Pharaoh can catch up to them with his army. God plans this whole thing. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians. This is what I mean. The text shows us the Israelites were shocked. They were surprised. They did not expect to see the Egyptians again. There were the Egyptians marching after them. This is a sudden change. They think they're in the clear. The Egyptian army shows up. they are terrified and they cry out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt?" Now, we can relate to this. This is going to happen to the Israelites again and again, and it happens to us in our everyday lives. God does things for the Israelites. He does big things to show them that he is the Lord. He's already done 10 plagues in Egypt. He's delivered them from Egypt. He's proven to them over and over that he is who he says he is and that he's going to help them, and yet they are terrified. I don't know what your reaction to that is. If you look at that and think of the Israelites they're just so weak in their faith. If that's what you think, stop thinking that. Because we are just like this all the time. Haven't you had the experience? If you are a follower of Jesus, you've had the experience where you prayed, you asked God to help you in a situation, God delivered you in an amazing way. And how did you feel right after he came through for you? You were praising the Lord. You were dancing, probably not literally, because most of us don't dance much. We don't. Maybe you didn't even literally raise your hands. But in your heart, you were so thrilled. You were full of faith. And then a week later, something bad happened to you. And how did you react? Everything's ruined. How am I ever going to get through this? Another impossible situation. This is a powerful image of what the life of faith is like. We continually fail to trust God. Continually. Even after he has shown himself faithful, shown who he is, shown that he's going to help us and answer us, even after he's shown us again and again, we still get scared and we don't know how things are going to work out when we can't see the solution. Didn't we say to you in Egypt, they complained to Moses a bunch. They want to go back to Egypt. Egypt was better. It's better to remain a slave than to live this life that's so scary, even if it's a life of worshiping God. And this is where I've said we're going to talk about in this section, freedom versus safety. You cannot worship the Lord and have the kind of safety that everybody in this world wants to have. Okay? You will have a certain kind of safety. The safety of knowing that God is there with you and he's going to protect you. But would you say that what the Israelites are doing right now is safe in the way we normally think of it? Just leave Egypt on foot, go where you've never been. Millions of people with hardly any food, hardly any water. They don't even have a cart with them. There's no carts, there's no wagons. They are being pursued by the Egyptians. This is as unsafe as it gets. And lots of them are going to die. It's that unsafe. So this is what I mean. They have been called out by God to live a life to worship the Lord in freedom. But what it looks like is pretty much zero human safety. And it's a dramatic illustration. It's an illustration for us. There is a choice to make in the life of faith. Truly following the Lord wherever he leads, or a life of human safety. Those are mutually exclusive. Moses answered the people, "Don't be afraid. Stand firm. You will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again." Moses is confident in this moment. It's amazing that he's confident. "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Now, it's a little bit of a funny thing. They do more than just be still. But they don't actually have to fight the battle on their own. They just have to trust God. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me?" This part's funny too. God is often kind of humorous, even in the Old Testament. He's deadly serious often, but the Israelites are encamped by the Red Sea. They have nowhere to go. The Egyptian army is bearing down on them, and God asks why they're crying out to him. This is kind of like, somebody said to me this week, it's kind of like when Jesus is sleeping on the boat and the boat is about to sink and the disciples are all scared because they're about to die. That's why they're scared. And they wake Jesus up and he says, "What are you afraid of? Did you have no faith?" Stunning. Tell the Israelites to move on. Tell them to move on. There's nowhere to go. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians. They will go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. He says this repeatedly. The Egyptians will know. The angel of the Lord who had been traveling in front of Israel's army. So at this point, actually I'm going to skip a little bit so we can get to the second half of the chapter. At this point, the angel, what it means is the pillar of cloud and fire. You see that here, moves in between the Israelites and the Egyptians to block the Egyptians from attacking them. And it's the middle of the night, or maybe not the middle, the beginning of the night. So all night long, the cloud keeps the Egyptian army in darkness while the Israelites are given light. So apparently, sometimes this pillar is a fire for the Israelites at night. It's a fire that gives them light. In the daytime, it's a cloud that they can see, so they know that God is with them. Apparently, at this moment, it's both. It's a cloud on one side, and it's a fire on the other to bring light to the Israelites and darkness to the Egyptians. A couple of points you can write down if you want to follow along in your notes. What does a life of freedom in the Lord look like? Freedom in the Lord requires boldness and faith. This is clearly shown by the Israelites. They march out boldly. They enter the waters. We'll see that in a minute. In faith. Freedom in the Lord does not always make sense. The life that you are going to live with God is not, every decision you make is not always going to make sense to the people around you. Because if you're following the Lord, he sees far more and he does things that no one would ever expect. So if you are really following the Lord, some of your decisions will not make sense to the people around you. Guaranteed. Freedom in the Lord is certainly not safe. Now, it is safe in a sense. God is there with you. It is the safest thing you can do in a sense, but it is not safe in the way we think about in this world. It is not safety patrol safe. It is not, the ball pit at the Chuck E. Cheese safe. It is a whole different kind of life that is often very scary. Let's take a look at actually going through the sea. Some images there. Here's what the text says about actually going through the sea. Moses stretches out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. This is probably the most striking piece of Bible evidence that it might be the big Exodus theory, that it's a lake somewhere near where the Egyptian delta, the Nile Delta. And that's because this line makes it sound like the water is parted by the wind. The water is parted by the wind. Although, I guess it does leave open the possibility that God brings a wind and uses miraculous supernatural power to move the water. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground. And this is very important. Look at all the detail that's in here. With a wall of water on their right and on their left. Now, this part's a little harder because if it's a lake, then there is water on their right and their left, but it's way off in the distance. Would the Israelites have described that as a wall of water on their right and their left? I don't know. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. The entire army goes into the sea. If it's a lake and it just looks like the sea has kind of like the tide's gone out, that's kind of what it looks like, then maybe this isn't that huge of a deal, right? Pharaoh's just pursuing them. If Pharaoh is pursuing them into the Gulf of Aqaba with 500 meters of water on each side, then Pharaoh has lost his mind. He's gone off the deep end in every way. He is so committed to this plan of action that he's gone into that he's lost all reason. During the last watch of the night, so there's details, this is a time. The last watch of the night, anybody know what time that is in the way the Bible keeps time? The last watch of the night is 3 a.m. At 3 a.m., the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw them into confusion. So they're actually crossing the Red Sea through these walls of water in the middle of the night. The whole thing happens at night. He jammed the wheels, he, the Lord, jammed the wheels of the Egyptian chariots, so they had difficulty driving. Lots of debate about exactly what that verse means. And the Egyptians said, let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. Again, maybe we're not all the way awake today. I often laugh when I read this verse. It's only now that the Egyptians realize the Lord is fighting against them and for the Israelites. The 10 plagues didn't make them realize that. The parting of the Red Sea didn't make them realize that God was on the side of the Israelites. It's only after the wheels on their chariots start falling off. You know what, though? I mean, even right now, I'm realizing that is how people are. It's only when my personal stuff is attacked that I finally realize something's happening. Like the whole world could be burning down, but if my house is okay, I'm like, yeah, everything's fine. Everything's good. But then, if my house gets robbed, now the whole world's falling apart. It seems to be what's happening with the Egyptians. When their chariots finally begin to break down, that's when they realize that they're in trouble. The Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak, the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it. Once again, lots of questions, debate about what exactly that means. And the Lord swept them into the sea. Most of this language, to me, describes massive walls of water that just annihilate this group, this army, like it had never existed. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. Notice it does not say Pharaoh died, but it very clearly says every single Egyptian in the army died. The Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and their left. The text repeats itself so that you make sure you get all of these details. The Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. You even have a description of the aftermath. And you probably don't think about that part. Certainly that part's not in the cartoons, is it? When the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord. Yeah, no kidding. And they put their trust in him and in his servant Moses. A few things we can take away from this. The Lord is right there with you. If you choose this life of freedom to worship the Lord, you will not have human safety, but what you will have is the Lord with you in your life. And that is far better than human safety. And he will bring deliverance. It's not the kind of deliverance we often want, where everything is all lined up and it's real easy. His deliverance is a lot more dangerous, but it is real deliverance. And finally, you must pay attention to him. That's something you can write down in your notes if you're following along. The Israelites, you might ask, why? Why do they forget? Why are they not able to trust God? And the truth is, they are able to trust him in a lot of ways. But in order to do so, they have to remember. They have to stop looking at the Egyptians, the impossible thing they can't overcome, and they have to turn their attention to the things God has shown them. The pillar of cloud, the pillar of fire, all the things God has already done in their lives. They have to remember those things. And that is active for them. They have to do it on purpose. So let's apply that for a minute, just as we wrap up. Let's try to apply this to our own lives. You got this massive world-changing event, and make no mistake, the modern world would not exist without the Exodus. Period. End of story. It happened. What does our road to freedom today look like? How does this story 3,200 years ago connect to my life right now? Hopefully you can already see a lot of ways, but let me just throw a few examples or areas, categories to illustrate how this might apply. Often I am in situations, you are in situations in your life that feel like there's no way out, that feel like I was trying to follow God and he was leading me, and I even took these steps that I thought were acts of faith, and now I end up in this place where nothing's working. Now I end up in this place where I'm just ruined. There's no way out of this situation, and my life's going to end. Okay, I know that might not really be true, literally, but that's how we feel in those situations. Finances. When you've been trying really hard to follow God, maybe you've even been tithing. You've been giving money, as God says, to be a generous person, and you're really struggling in your budget. The numbers don't add up. What are you supposed to do in those situations? You're supposed to remember. You are just like the Israelites in that moment. When the Egyptians are bearing down on them, you look up and suddenly your bank account is right there screaming at you, there's not enough money. Or your credit card account, even worse. What do you do in that situation? You have to do what the Israelites did. You have to cry out to the Lord, and then you have to remember that he's there with you and not give in to the temptation to try and fix it in your own strength alone. You might have to do stuff. You might have to do things even that are scary, like entering the Red Sea, but you have to let God lead you in those situations, not try to take matters into your own hands alone. Finances, aging and health issues, exactly the same pattern. I was following God, and then all of a sudden this thing came into my life. I can't, whatever the health issue is, I can't do this anymore. I can't do that anymore. I'm in pain. I'm struggling. Or maybe it's just the natural progression of aging and you don't know how to deal with. Why does God let us go through certain things as we get older? Some people more, some people less. What do I do in those situations when it seems impossible? Exactly the same pattern. You apply the pattern of the Exodus. You remember, you cry out to the Lord, you look at the things he's already done, you let him lead, and you follow him into the sea. What about big decisions in your life? Maybe you got something scary that you feel maybe God is leading you toward, marriage or a big move or maybe starting a career or a career change, big things that happen in life that scare you. You apply the pattern of the Red Sea. You follow that road to freedom. You pay attention to the Lord. You cry out to him. You follow his lead. You don't try to take control in your own strength, and you trust him. You actively decide to trust him. Broken relationships can feel just like that, like there's no way out. Or even, I'll say at the end, just any situation in your life where you feel backed up into a corner. On one side, there's an army trying to destroy you, and on the other side, there's a sea that you could never cross. Any situation that seems like there's no way out, the Bible is asking you to apply the pattern of the Red Sea, to trust God, to cry out to him, to let him lead, to remember what he's done for you, and to take steps of faith. Let's pray.